Thank you. I realised that that was quite a mouthful, so as you've seen, I somewhat shortened the title, Can Policy Improve Gender Inequalities in Paid and Unpaid Work? And I'm really delighted to have been invited to address this celebratory 10th conference of the Family and Parenting Institute. And the theme of today's conference, which is, as you're aware, Policies for Families, Challenges and Choices, is really very apt when it comes to thinking about the gender division of labour, because we tend to think of the way that parents divide up their labour between paid employment and unpaid family care work as a matter of individual choice. But this really masks the degree to which people's choices are differentially constrained by gender. And what I want to argue is that unless policies address this unequal division of men and women between paid and unpaid work, unless we do more to equal the contributions in unpaid work, then all of our work-family policies are likely to be of somewhat limited effectiveness. So in order to understand what policies might facilitate or mitigate against work-family balance, I want to examine the way that there's been changes in the division of labour among couples in Britain over the past decade. I'll also be exploring why gender inequalities in unpaid work are so very slow to change. And I'll be asking the question of can, and if so how, policies might reduce gender inequalities in paid and unpaid work. I probably don't need to argue to this audience why that matters. What I will be suggesting is that as long as couples are not a lifelong stable group, then this inequality matters a great deal in terms of the financial security, particularly of mothers and children. And then in the last part of the talk, I want to look at some work I've been involved in seeing how public opinion and gender role attitudes is changing. And this is quite a worrying story, because after a long period of moving in the more egalitarian direction, there's been a retreat. And I think it's important, it's easy to understand, but we do need to be concerned about it and ask what can be done. Now, before I look at the division of labour for couples, I think it's worth considering some of the changes in men and women's participation in the labour market. So over the past couple of decades, and you can see along the bottom you've got years running here from 1983 to 2005, and I'll give you a quick update. We can see the decline in male full-time employment that took place in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And of course, now we're seeing another decline with the current recession, and it's going to be a while before we climb out of that as far as unemployment is concerned. The line at the bottom, the sort of pinkish line, is men's part-time work, and you can see it's really at a very low threshold, but it is increasing over time, and it's continuing to increase. For women, both full-time and part-time work has steadily increased across this time, and despite early fears that this recession was really going to have a very bad effect on women's jobs, that's not yet been seen in terms of the statistics. Now, what's particularly relevant to my concern today is the divide up of paid and unpaid work among couples and how this differs depending on whether or not the woman has kids. So on the left-hand side there, you've got the employment rate, and you can see at the top line with the yellow blobs, women who are childless have always had very high rates of employment. Women who have kids in couples are still working more. There's an increase in that line, but most of the increase in employment over this time period, from 1992 to 2004 here and continuing, is for mums of young children, children under school age. But then the question is, well, what's happening to unpaid work as females are increasing their hours of paid work? And it's really going to be, again, no surprise to this audience that if you hear, for reasons I could explain, Sue Harkness, who did this research using the British Household Panel study, this panel that follows 5,000 households across time, she's tracking the amount of unpaid work wives and husbands do in relation to the wife's paid work. It's a slightly different pattern when you get cohabiting couples, and I could talk more about that, but it's not that much different. The basic story is the same. The men's take-up of housework or unpaid work of any description is very, very slight with the increase in the woman's hours of paid work. But of course, the woman, the more she is working, has to actually put down the unpaid tasks of family chores and family care. And that line is decreasing much more rapidly, as you would expect. So because this is a study that actually follows the same people over time, my colleague who I've put there at the top, Jay Gashuni, is the professor of sociology at Oxford, and he's been studying what happens in Britain, in the United States, and also in Australia when the woman goes back to work after having her first child. So she's re-entering full-time work after her first child. And what he finds is that we do have this process of what he refers to as lagged adaptation. The male partner does start to do more around the home, but the take-up of the male partner in terms of unpaid work is very slow. It can be as long as 2 years after the woman's re-entered paid work. And it's also incredibly inconsistent. It just doesn't happen in some couples. Now, one of the important things I think to bear in mind with policy responses is we're still working often with this old mindset of the male breadwinner family. Obviously, policymakers know that that's not the reality, but nevertheless, that was the mindset against which many of our policies were formed. And I think this graph is just amazing. It shows you the change that's occurred over the 20th century. Across the bottom, you've got the years when these women were born, and up the side, on the vertical axis, you've got how old the kid would be by the time half of the mums were back in paid employment. And so for women born at the beginning of the century, only half of the women were back in jobs when the kid reached the age of 13, 14. By the time you come to the 1946 cohort, women born in 1946, half of them were back in the labor force by the time the child reached 6. When you come to 1970, half of the women are back in the labor force. Really, after maternity leave, it's by the time the child reaches 1. And what's interesting there is you can see this gap emerging between women, among women, by education. So it's those with higher education qualifications are re-entering the labor force much more quickly. So what's actually happening in these households where there's couples with kids under the age of 5? And again, I'm drawing on some of Sue Harkness's work using the British Household Panel Study. And in a sense, that model that we have of the male breadwinner family still actually is statistically correct. The most common type of work arrangements amongst couples with children under the age of 5 is still the one-earner family. So we're just looking at couples, and this is overwhelmingly the man working, the woman not. The modified breadwinner family comes second, where the woman is working part-time, and it's just about 1 in 5 couple households with kids under the age of 5, where you've got the dual earner model. And that no earner model, of course, is something which is going up again with the current recession, but still will be tiny in comparison to the other work arrangements. Now, my question about can policy actually make a difference in reducing the gender inequality in unpaid work? There are very different policy initiatives in terms of trying to promote work-family balance. And very crudely, you could say that there's sort of 2 extremes that policy can adopt. We can have the adult worker model as if it's gender undifferentiated, or we can have some version which acknowledges that men and women's attachment to the labor market is different. And at the extreme of the adult worker model, undifferentiated, you could say, is the States, which really has very little in the way of provision for supporting work-family balance. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that our American sisters didn't actually get the right to unpaid maternity leave until 1996. And then, as you were hearing more this morning, not surprisingly, the other extreme is in the Scandinavian countries, where there's much greater provision for work-family balance. But there is still an acknowledgement of gender difference, even though that you've got policy measures like use it or lose it in terms of father's leave to really encourage the take-up of parental leave by the dads. Still got quite a marked gender difference, but policy can nudge towards greater egalitarianism, and that's hugely important because of the sort of symbolic value it has in altering the normative climate in terms of which gender you're expecting to do what. And you can actually trace the fact that policy can make a difference. Again, I'm drawing on my colleague Jay Gashuni's work, where he uses time budget data to look at the allocation of paid and unpaid work across different countries. So here, just concentrating on the 5 I was partly including before in looking at the differential policies. Now, I think the first thing to get your head around is that these numbers refer to minutes per day. So if you're thinking, sort of 480 minutes, we're up with our 8 hours of paid and unpaid work here. And looking at those two bottom rows, it might be somewhat surprising that they're not actually that different. Quite often you hear about women's, sort of double bind, as if most of the work falls on the female sex. And I hate to be a traitor, but in terms of adding up the amount of paid and unpaid work, things are relatively equitable between men and women in these very different policy contexts. But what's hugely lopsided is the relative amount of paid versus unpaid work that men and women do. And so men are doing much less of the core domestic work, the housework and the cooking. They're also doing significantly less of the other unpaid work, which is things like childcare and shopping and the odd jobs around the home in terms of the way it's classified here. But what you can see, if you're sort of good at comparing numbers very speedily, is that the Swedish men are actually the most equitable across these countries. And that's no coincidence in terms of the policies pushing towards greater gender egalitarianism. So, I want to ask, does this gender imbalance in paid and unpaid work matter? Because if women are doing less of the paid work, men are doing more, then isn't it equitable that women are doing the bulk of the unpaid work? And after all, in principle, it could easily be the other way round. The woman could be the main breadwinner and the man the house husband or whatever. But of course the gender wage gap and the normative pressures tend to reinforce the traditional gender divide. And that matters given that the couple usually isn't an economic lifelong unit. We've got now enough couple instability for it to really raise the risk both to women and children if women are compromising their earning potential. Also, really is an issue for older women in terms of their much more limited qualification for employer pensions. Now, I want to turn to the last part of this talk, which is really looking at gender roles and public opinion, because, as I said, the pattern seems to be that there's been a retreat from support of more gender egalitarian roles, particularly in Great Britain and the States. And my worry is that if public opinion's pulling back from support of gender egalitarian roles, then it's going to drop down the policy agenda. And that's a misunderstanding, I think, of what this public opinion shift is about. So I think this is important just to try and take a couple of minutes to explain. If you just look at a single item, family life suffers if the woman works full time. Now here the egalitarian response is disagreeing with that assertion. Family life suffers if the woman is in full-time employment. And you can see from this chart that there's different levels of support for the egalitarian position across countries. I haven't split this down by men and women, but you'll see in the following charts that women are always slightly more egalitarian than men, you might argue that men have more interest in sort of status quo, traditional gender role divide. But it's at very different levels, and in Great Britain and the United States, you know, sort of support for egalitarian roles is really quite high. Italy here is the most sort of chauvinistic, and the reason that we don't have this third bar in Italy is simply that they weren't participants in the third wave of this survey. Now, obviously, it would be just plain daft to take the one item, and then build great generalizations about it. And in these surveys, we have a whole battery of questions which tend to work in a fairly consistent way. So it's much better simply to take them all and make a gender role index. And these other questions are things like this ideological question: it's the husband's job to earn the income, it's the wife's job to take care of the children, which tends to be a very robust measure of gender role attitudes. But if we put them all together, we can see they behave in a quite sensible, expected way, in that I was saying the trend is towards greater support for egalitarian roles. It's younger generations who think there should be a more equitable divide between men and women in family roles. Older generations were much more traditional in their attitudes, as you would expect, and this holds right across countries. So part of this social change that we've been seeing in public opinion and gender roles is simply due to the older generations dying out with their more traditional views, and younger generations meaning that social change is moving in an egalitarian direction. But even if you control for that, and you take account of the changes in education and other things, you're still getting a period or time effect, which means that over time, comparing 1988 here, 1994 and 2002, in the States and in Great Britain, for both men and women, you were getting this increase in egalitarianism and then a retreat. Not really the sort of backlash, but just more caution. People are less sanguine about the notion that mums can go out to full-time work and the family won't suffer at all. And I'm just using that, you know, as a shorthand for this whole gender role scale. In West Germany, you don't see the same thing. I mean, they started from a lower level in terms of support for more equitable gender roles, and they're still getting more liberal. And so in Scandinavia, support is still continuing. And I think this is a story that matters. Cambridge did a press release on that when a book around this issue sort of came out, and it got surprising to me publicity. Some of it doubtless because, you know, sort of mums and babies are such photographable things, sort of sells papers. No guessing probably the Nicola Hollick, is that her name? That picture of Supermum, the woman who manages the sort of hedge fund type things and has 5 children, and to the Daily Mail's delight has had a recent divorce, came under the heading, you know, for Supermums the shine is wearing off. Now, I think the explanation for the public opinion reversal is simply that women's roles have changed a lot, men's roles haven't changed much, and policy hasn't caught up with family change. And so public opinion is actually just being honest. It's really tough on families when women are working full-time, and that does not mean that nothing needs to be done about this issue. So as soon as you've got an issue like this in the public arena, then you can get the lobbyists speaking out for change. And the Fawcett Society, Kat Banyard, was making the point that our long work hours culture and our lack of flexible working means actually that both men and women are straitjacketed in these gender roles. And a report for the Equality and Human Rights Commission has just recently come out on work-life balance, and Catherine Rake was making a similar point. It's clear that many fathers want to spend more time with their children, and they want flexible working to be extended so it becomes part of everyday life. Now, I hope I've said enough to make it absolutely clear that I don't think this gender imbalance in paid and unpaid work is a laughing matter. But I do think humour can actually be quite useful sometimes for making us more aware of the stereotypes and the misrepresentations that underpin gender inequality. And so I just wanted to leave you with one of my favourite cartoons from the New Yorker, which I think makes the point well. Thank you very much.